coming way, way early, since we've got half an hour until we actually start, we can start forming a queue so we can ask Vitalik a few questions now, so then at the end, we go faster. How does that sound to everyone? Is that okay? Does anybody have questions? If you have questions for Vitalik, you can come over here, because we've got half an hour until we start.
So my question is, in the present Ethereum, all the dapp developers like us are using Infura or Alchemy or similar like nodes for hire. Will we have a better system with Ethereum 2 so that we don't need to have centralized nodes for hire?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think a big part of the reason why everyone is still relying on centralized node providers now is that Ethereum 1.0 light clients are honestly just not very good and not very light. So for example, like even just the data load from a light client is something like 500 bytes every 15 seconds, and then you have to sync, and then the network is sometimes not the most stable. So in Ethereum 2, we've been taking light clients extremely seriously. So for example, the minimum amount of data needed to sync a light client is something like 15 kilobytes per day, which basically means that on any remotely modern system, if you're offline with a light client and you come back online, you can pretty much just download a single file within 1 second and get synced again. And from there, a group plans to put a lot of resources into making all of these client-server networks work really efficiently, so you can download local branches and like do all of the queries you need without needing to trust central parties. So,
right. Okay, I've got another mic, so if you have a question before the presentation, there will be questions after as well. Raise your hand and I'll come with the mic and you can ask the question.
Questions after the presentation will have to be about the presentation.
Yes, definitely. So if you have questions outside.
No, this is serious. Like,
yeah.
No, once I presented at this event in San Francisco, and after the event, literally none of the questions were about my presentation. So.
Okay. So any general questions, not about the presentation? Yeah.
All right, thanks very much for coming back, Vitalik. We never thought we'd see you again. No, I'm joking. You're like Willy Wonka, you come out when there's important news. So one of the things I want to ask you is a little bit about the Libra, Facebook's new crypto option. Is there anything you guys are thinking about, preparing for when this is to come?
Yeah, and so I guess first of all, from a technical point of view, Libra doesn't really introduce anything that impressive, and like their people admit it themselves. Like there is the move language, which I do think is legitimately interesting, but otherwise there's no like jaw-dropping sharding or like N,000 transactions per second or $0 or any of those things, right? So the reason why people are interested in Libra at all is that it comes attached to Facebook and potentially this other large set of companies, and so potentially like an existing multi-billion user market. So any like a kind of strategy for how Ethereum projects can continue to kind of prosper and benefit from some, like in the context of something like this existing is not going to be focused on technical aspects as much as it's going to be focused on like, well, there is this project that has a large number of users, and how can we kind of leverage that to bring more healthy adoption to the ecosystem. So one part of that could be designing bridges between blockchains, for example. And designing bridges should actually not be too difficult. Another example possibility would be trying to have developer ecosystem compatibility between them. So, for example, make Move compilable to EVM or WASM or something like that. And there's definitely other things that could be done, even just some decentralized exchange bridge between the two. So if you have LBR, you can just easily convert it into ETH and do stuff in Ethereum Land. We've talked to some of their people, and this is still like early stage. We'll see.
Ooh, a lot more questions. People are.
Hello. ETH wants ETH2, how is the sway and the flow going to be cajoled and convinced to move from ETH1 into ETH2?
Sure. So ultimately, I think the thing that will motivate people to switch to ETH2 in the long and move to ETH2 in the long term is just the fact that ETH2 offers much more. You get, say, a proof of stake chain with a faster finality, functioning like client, way more scalability, and all more efficient general purpose smart contracts and all of those nice things. And of course, it will inevitably take time for that to happen, because for no matter what we do for the first year of ETH2's existence, it'll be a much more untested system than ETH1 has been so far, which has survived through multiple years of attempted attacks and successful DOS attacks and security hardening and all those other things. And I think I definitely don't expect people to kind of fight back hard against ETH2, because a lot of the core ideas like proof of stake and sharding have been kind of recognized, I think, as being part of Ethereum's core roadmap for a long time. And if anyone is really opposed to them, then there's Ethereum Classic, which is ready and waiting for them, and they've already started to kind of express interest in adopting Ethereum 1 features in their roadmap. And then I think the other part of the kind of transition is just at some point the ETH1 system itself is going to be folded into ETH2. And that will be a hard fork, and so people will have to actually install it. And so there is obviously the possibility of a continuing chain if people just decide not to install it en masse. But if people do, which I think is overwhelmingly likely, then basically what's going to happen is we'll take the hard fork will take the state root of the ETH1 chain and basically just import it into the ETH2 system. And this is the proposal that I find most credible. It will continue to exist inside of ETH2 as an execution environment. So you'll be able to send transactions that get processed by exactly the same rules, and it'll all happen under the ETH2 system.
Okay, making my way.
So, hi. With regards to networking and ETH2.0, there seems to be a lot of contention around P2P. What's your view on it? Would it be better if we had like ETH 1.0, where you have a networking stack built just for ETH 2.0?
I guess the problem. And I'll admit that I personally am kind of a bit more distant from peer-to-peer networking aspects of ETH2 design than I am from all of the consensus theory and crypto-economic part of the design. I guess the trade-off is do you either create your own network so you can customize it for your use case, or do you build on top of something more generic? And I do feel like from a kind of very outside view, building on top of something more generic is a much better option, because Ethereum is not the only thing that benefits from decentralized networking, right? IPFS benefits from it, non-Ethereum ecosystem blockchains benefit from it, lots of other things that are going to get built are going to benefit from it. And it already has support for the ability to just create different subnetworks, which we're going to need for sharding. So there's a lot of existing things going for it. Now, of course, over the last year, a lot of the client teams have discovered that many of the libTDP implementations are kind of not quite as mature as they had thought before, and so they had to do a lot of work explicitly on just pushing forward, making them better. And at that point, theoretically, either approach would work. I guess I personally would still say that it's good to try to collaborate with other projects, because that way we don't have to duplicate as much effort. And I don't think Ethereum has kind of that deep differences from other systems that exist and are going to exist in the future.
Hi, I'm Gavin, founder and CEO of Cointelligence. My question is, I've noticed some Ethereum people posting online a 4-parts plan, and they market it, some of them pretty much aggressively. I wanted to ask first if you support that.
What is this 4-part plan?
The next steps for Ethereum.
Okay. Oh, so this is basically the ETH2 roadmap? Yeah, I support the ETH2 roadmap.
Thank you.
So congratulations, Vitalik, for your first ever blockchain in launching Ethereum. My question is what is the future of Ethereum hold? And I know you mentioned about scalability. There's a lot of other blockchains trying to scale as fast as Ethereum, such as a few others that I don't want to mention, but I do know that they are trying to catch up. Where is Ethereum going in terms of its scalability?
I mean, if there's many different projects in the Ethereum ecosystem that are taking different paths at scalability, like stage channels and plasma are one of them. Another is something that I'm going to talk about today. A third is just ETH 2.0 itself. I do fundamentally believe that if any one of those three succeeds, then Ethereum will have become scalable enough for the use cases that it'll need for at least the next couple of decades. So, like right now, I believe that scalability is a big bottleneck for not just Ethereum, but basically every public blockchain that exists. But once these technologies exist, I definitely think that they will be fine from that point of view. And I think at some point it's going to switch over to just developer experience being really important, usability being really important, and privacy being important, and a lot of other things.
There you go.
I wanted to ask you regarding ETH2 development, how much do you think about the fact that Ethereum should be money? So about when designing the crypto economic aspects, how important and how much thought goes into making it accrue monetary premium?
Yeah, so I guess, like, first of all, there are a lot of kind of aligned interests between having value and the Ethereum blockchain being secure. Because if the price of Ether drops to zero, then ultimately, no matter what the incentives are not going to be worth anything because they'll just be editing numbers in a database nobody cares about. So the incentive structure is definitely, like that constraint is, I think, definitely something that we just recognize and have to work with. And like the desire to keep issuance limited, for example, is definitely like one of the considerations in trying to design the proof of stake system. Basically, because keeping issuance limited, even having sinks so that Ether can, some portion of transaction fees can get burned, and all of those things are things that reduce the risk of Ether becoming much less valuable or worth less in a more unfavorable climate. And that's something that we have to do, not because we want to get as rich as possible as quickly as possible, but because it just is necessary to ensure sustainability of the Ethereum network's security going forward for a long time. So, yeah. How about some back row people?
Yeah. We'll do questions afterwards as well. So it's not. This is not the only Q&A. There will be more Q&A.
Hello, looking forward to the talk. Can you please clarify what you meant when you said Turing completeness was a red herring?
Sure. So basically, the idea here is that there's differences between how Bitcoin script, which was the main comparison point to Ethereum back then, operates, and how code Ethereum's virtual machine operates. And it does mean that Ethereum's scripting language is fundamentally much more expressive. So, for example, one of the things that you can't do in Bitcoin that you can do in Ethereum is write contracts that say, if you do this, then after this happens, within 16 hours, someone will be able to do that. After 16 hours, someone will be able to do something else. Or if someone does something, then some option unlocks so that anyone can perform some operation that moves the contract to some other state. When the contract moves to some other state, someone will be able to do something else. So basically, anything involving kind of non-trivial amounts of state storage. So for example, Uniswap cannot be done in Bitcoin, Plasma, and it can't even be done in kind of logical extensions to Bitcoin scripting like Simplicity. Plasma can't really be done. Assurance contracts that are enforceable can be done. So like you can do Lighthouse, but Lighthouse has this issue that you can pretty much leave your commitment anytime you want to. And if you don't want to allow that, there's no way to do it. Scorched Earth Vault, so this is the thing where if you have a smart contract, you can withdraw money, but you have to send one transaction, then wait 24 hours, then send another. Within the 24 hours, you can cancel. So there's this large class of applications that you can do in Ethereum-like systems that you can't do in Bitcoin-like systems. But the reason why Turing completeness isn't the best way to describe this is because Turing completeness really focuses on the distinction between programming language that support dynamic numbers of loops versus programming languages that don't support dynamic numbers of loops. And that really does not correspond to this difference between Bitcoin scripting and Ethereum that we're trying to get at, right? So for example, like Viper is not a Turing complete language. It does not support dynamic looping. Every loop has to have a static number of loops, but you can still do everything interesting that you want to do inside of Viper. So that's why I started trying to push for kind of rich statefulness as a better description of this, what Ethereum's set of contract and state model is in Turing completeness. Yeah, and another thing is that Ethereum is not Turing complete anyway because you have a gas limit, so every program has a hard limit on the number of steps after which it halts. So you can solve the halting problem for Ethereum, so it's not Turing complete.
Okay, one last question for this session, then we'll do some admin and then we'll start in 10 minutes. Yeah?
So I have a question about phase 0 and ETH2. So my understanding is the functionality will be pretty limited, but there will be the option to take your ETH from ETH1 or Ethereum 1 and move them to 2.
Yes.
So, and lock them up, and without necessarily being able to bring them back just yet. So as an individual, what would be my incentive to do so if I have limited functionality on ETH2?
Basically, you'll be able to do something interesting, and you'll be able to earn validator rewards. Those are basically the benefits of being a validator in the ETH2 system in phase 0. Right, so phase 0 is intended as a kind of warm up for ETH2. And we recognize that it'll likely have lower levels of participation than it will in the future. But the goal is to just allow the chain to kind of get off the ground running, and if there are issues that appear in a live network early on, they can happen before there's significant stuff depending on it. Yeah. That will diffuse the plan.
Okay, that's it for now. We'll take a 10-minute short break if you guys can chat, and then we'll start with the presentation. Thank you.
Hello! So, who here wants to hear about hybrid layer 2 protocols? Who here wants to hear about full layer 3 protocols? Yeah. Not today. So, who here has heard of Plasma before? Who here has not heard of channels before? Who here has heard of channels before? So, basically, Plasma and channels are kind of the two existing big families of layer 2 protocols that exist as scaling solutions for transactions on blockchains today. I mean, there are other things like custodial wallets and custodial sidechains, for example, but I'm trying kind of sticking to the kind of purely what we call trustless or purely crypto-economic version so far. So things that don't require kind of specific centralized and third-party trust assumptions. So the way that Plasma and channels both generally work, right, is that there are these systems where transactions happen off-chain by default. And what that means is that transaction data goes off-chain, and also the computation involved in executing and verifying transactions happens off-chain, with 3 exceptions. One of them is people entering the system, so people joining a channel or joining a Plasma chain. The second is people exiting. And the third is disputes. So a dispute basically happens when 2 different actors in the system disagree about what happened. Like basically that, like because these are fully kind of computational deterministic systems, a dispute really only happens when one of the participants has a bug in their code or decides to try acting maliciously, and so forcing the other participants to do something on-chain to react. And you'll be, because of the way in which this layer 2 system is set up, you're guaranteed that if you have money inside of the layer 2 system, you will be able to get your money out into the underlying layer 1 system. So if you have coins inside of a channel or inside of a Plasma system, those coins are really sitting inside of a smart contract, and the smart contract has logic inside of it that enforces this idea that if you actually legitimately own coins according to the rules of the layer 2 system, then you can publish proof data into the contract if you want to, and there exists this kind of game that we call an exit game, where you will be able to submit data and other people might be able to submit data, but if you legitimately own assets, then you will be able to get those assets out. And if you do not legitimately own assets, you will not be able to legitimately get those assets out. So by default, all off-chain. If someone tries to do something funny, then you might have to react and do some transactions on-chain. Now, state channels, Plasma, the Lightning Network, Raiden is an Ethereum Lightning Network equivalent. So these things have been kind of fairly prominent buzzwords for a while. And they're great. Yay, scaling, lots of scaling. But, so at the same time though, right, there's some limits to what these layer 2 protocols can do. So, the Lightning Network, like it's been having these capital efficiency issues, usability issues. Plasma on Ethereum, like it seems like we know how to do it for payments, but as soon as you try to generalize it to an exchange, it gets harder. And if you try to generalize it to really general purpose computation, then it turns out like it seems like without snarks or starks, you can't do it. And even with snarks or starks, it's hard. So I want to try to give an intuition as to why like there is this challenge, right? Like why it's proving to be so difficult to get layer 2 protocols off the ground, and why it seems to be not really feasible to come up, at least so far, come up with a layer 2 protocol that replicates just the Ethereum experience, the ability to write a contract in EVM code, publish it to the net, and have it be something that anyone can just interact with. So this is, in the previous slide, I split up scaling data and data going off-chain versus computation going off-chain. And the reason why I did that is because the rest of this presentation will be about data being off-chain, but computation still being off-chain. Now, it turns out that protocols where computation is off-chain are not that hard to build. Protocols where computation and data are off-chain are harder. And I want to give an intuition for why. So this is a protocol for doing just any kind of computation on-chain in such a way that the chain finds out what the result of the computation is without the entire computation having to be done on-chain in the normal case, right? So let's say you have some really complicated computation you want to do, and you don't want to do all of it on-chain. So if you're kind of technical, you want some examples, like one example for this might be verifying a BLS aggregate signature with a pile of participants. BLS aggregate signature is just 1 bit per participant, but per participant you have to do a pairing computation, so the computation to data ratio is really huge. So you want to try to avoid doing the computation, and you really care specifically about avoiding the computation. Let's say you have a computation, f of x equals y, that you can represent as a series of steps. So you take X, you pass it through F1, pass it through F2, pass it through F3, blah, blah, eventually you pass it through Fn, and Y comes out the other end. Here is a protocol for interactively evaluating that computation. So you have some class of parties that we call submitters, and really submitting can be fully permissionless. Anyone can just show up and submit. And if you submit, what you need to do is you need to send a transaction. That transaction contains a deposit. So the deposit could be 10 Ether, for example. And that transaction would also contain a transcript of all of the intermediate states. Right, so intermediate state S1 is just X passing through F1, intermediate state S2 is S1 and then passing it further through F2, S3 would pass it through F3, and so on and so on and so forth, all the way up to Sn. So you take this kind of transcript that contains the start state, the end state, and all these intermediate states, publish it in a transaction to chain along with your deposit, and then a challenge period starts. And this could be an hour, could be a week, it's purely a security convenience trade-off. Within that challenge period, anyone can submit a challenge index. So anyone can try to run the full computation off-chain and work for themselves. And if they discover, oh hey, looks like F1, or S1, S2 all the way up to S42 are fine, but S43 is not fine, then they can submit 42 as a challenge index. And then, as part of executing that transaction on-chain, F42 is actually going to be verified, and the chain now finds out that, hey, the provided S43 actually does not equal to F42 of the provided S42. And so the submitter did something wrong, the submitter loses their deposit, the challenger gets part of it as a reward. If there are no successful challenges for a long time, then the result is accepted. So the key observation here, right, is that this game is very friendly to honest participants. If you participate in this game dishonestly, you're taking a really huge risk. And as long as there is one honest participant that's just running through the computation and checking it, then it's, that honest participant is going to be able to prevent any bad outputs from getting through, and that one honest participant is going to make a lot of money doing it, so there's lots of incentive. So do people see, so I guess, to kind of summarize what this is doing, right? Basically, the idea here is that we have a computation, and we want the chain to evaluate the result, because there's some application on chain that cares about the result. The naive way of doing it is to just execute F entirely on chain. If that's too hard and there's too many scalability issues with that, instead we use this interactive protocol, and so instead of actually executing F, the chain just by default just has to download these or hold these intermediate states. And in general, there aren't going to be challenges, but even when there are challenges, it only needs to run one tiny little bit of F. So you get a lot of scaling for computation. So do people see how computation can be scaled? Now, data. So let's say you have a file, and that file has 1 megabyte, and you don't want to publish the 1 megabyte to chain because it's going to be expensive. Can you prove to a chain that you actually published the file? So can you prove to a chain that you published the file and you're not withholding it? Turns out that you can't. So basically, the problem here is that you cannot have an equivalence protocol for verifying availability of data. And the reason why you can't have an equivalence protocol for verifying the availability of data is because, unlike computation, where once you pre-commit to some value, that is the value, you can't change anything afterwards. With data availability, if you didn't publish data at one point in time, you can always just publish data at some point in the future. So I created this kind of chart that I call the fisherman's dilemma. And so the idea here is that imagine if we have an interactive game that's kind of similar spirit to the interactive game for computation. So basically the idea here is that you have people who publish blocks, and if some piece of data in the block is unavailable, then you challenge it and you say, hey blockchain, I think this data is unavailable. So let's imagine that you're living in one of these two worlds. You're either living in case 1 or you're living in case 2. In case 1, at time t1, some validator who's evil publishes a block with missing data. At time t2, someone else, some honest policeman raises an alarm, and at time t3, the evil validator just goes ahead and says, okay, fine, I'll just publish the remaining data. In case 2, the original validator is actually published a full block, but at time t2, this other validator actually raises a false alarm. Now, the interesting thing here, right, is that the blockchain is only going to, if it has a way of checking for the availability of data, it's really going to only be able to check for the availability of data after time t3. And the problem is that if you only start looking at that particular piece of data after time t3, you have no way of determining whether you're living in world 1 or you're living in world 2. So you don't know whether the block publisher or the person raising an alarm are which one of the two is malicious. You know that one of them is malicious because they disagree with each other, but you don't know which one. And so then you have the dilemma that basically says, if you do not penalize making alarms in general, then if you don't penalize making alarms in general, then you're either vulnerable to a DOS, or if you reward making alarms, then the protocol can be money pumped. And if you penalize making an alarm, then basically bad actors can just keep delaying data until no one publishes alarms anymore. Yes?
So from T2 to T3, what convinced the guy to publish the remaining data?
Oh, this is just the attacker's strategy. The attacker's strategy is if anyone raises an alarm, then they just immediately publish the rest of the data.
Okay.
So the point of this strategy is it's a kind of an attack that just tries to, and successfully manages to exhaust everyone raising an alarm. It's kind of like, it's basically, it's a sort of boy who cries wolf situation, right? Imagine you have a wolf, and then every time someone cries wolf, the wolf disappears. And so eventually, after a few weeks, everyone in the village thinks that the people crying wolf are all crazy. And once they stop crying wolf, then the wolf actually comes in and eats everyone. So, so this is the data availability problem, right? So basically, you just can't scale data. Now, there are availability in the same way you can scale computation. Now, there are other ways to get around this problem, but they don't fit into the same format of being usable as a layer 2 protocols on top of an existing layer 1 blockchain. So, plasma and channels. Plasma and channels do not solve data availability. They bypass it. So, here's what I mean by this, right? So, here is how plasma and channels work as far as data availability goes, right? So in a plasma system, the plasma chain operator is supposed to publish all of the data for all of the blocks they commit to the chain. But they don't have to do that. They might not do it. But fortunately, the chain never has to learn whether or not the data is available. Because if you, as a user of the system, discover that the data is not available to you, you just make a personal choice to exit. Now, so no one needs to care who was really at fault, right? Basically, you just figure out for any particular piece of state inside of the system, you figure out who is the beneficiary of that state. They have the ability to exit the data, and if they're not happy with the chain's availability, they just exit. Plasma and channels, their exit games, both rely on this kind of most recent signature is truth principle. Right, so the way both of these protocols basically work is that if there is if you send me 10 coins inside of a channel or inside of a plasma system, then I receive a transaction from you that sends those 10 coins. And in the case of plasma, plus a Merkle branch that proves that that's part of a block. Now, if I were to send a transaction, then I have to sign something and then send it off to the network. So if I have a Merkle branch, or in the case of channels, just a signature from you that says you gave me this asset, and I personally know that I never signed a message after that transferring the asset to someone else, then I have the information that says I have this asset now, and I personally know that no one can challenge me because no one did something. There was no operation that could have been done later to take this asset away, and so I can publish evidence to the contract, and so I can win and get the asset out. Right, so I have enough information to know that I can win the game, And you don't, basically the whole process just kind of bypasses data availability because it's all about, well, number one, the data that you already have, and number two, this interesting fact that you, as a user, know that there is no signature sending data from you which is available because you know you never made such a signature. So basically, both of these like Plasma and Channels, these systems, really strongly rely on this kind of principle of, well, let's make the system safe by kind of carefully attaching responsibility for state objects to the beneficiaries of those state objects. And if a state object for which you are the beneficiary, if the data for that state object starts being unavailable, then it is your incentive and your responsibility and your ability to start this exit procedure and take it out. So there's this kind of underlying assumption that says everything has an owner. And furthermore, everything has a single owner, and that owner has the ability to exit that thing from the system. Problem, these techniques do not generalize. Uniswap. Who's the owner of Uniswap? I mean, I own a few Uniswap liquidity shares. That doesn't make me the owner of Uniswap. And the person who deployed the Uniswap contract theoretically has the ability to vote with all the ether stuck inside of it in some of these voting DAOs, but they're still not the owner. Uniswap doesn't have an owner, right? And lots of systems don't have owners. Even systems that do have owners, they violate some of these assumptions. Account-based payments. The reason why Plasma has to do UTXO-based payments instead of going with a similar account-based approach is because Plasma really strongly leans on this idea that you cannot change the state of someone else's account without their consent, right? And the reason why that's important is that ensures that everyone, if they're honest, always has an up-to-date copy of their own account state. Problem with a balance-based system is that in a balance-based system, you can muck around with other people's money without their consent, just only in the upward direction. Now, generally, you want to have your money mucked around within the upward direction, but in the case of Plasma, this kind of brings the security guarantees. Plasma Cash also depends on an assumption that there aren't kind of cross-dependencies between coins. So, and dependency trees kind of don't really intersect much. Dependency trees don't expand much as time goes back historically. Even atomic swaps break this, and more complex applications break this very quickly. So basically, the fact that layer 2 systems as they exist force you to really explicitly do this thinking about who's the owner, who's the beneficiary, how do we match incentives here, and it doesn't generalize to contexts where that doesn't work well, basically means that layer 2 systems have a complicated and radically unfamiliar developer experience, and you just can't have this kind of write a contract and publish it feel that the EVM has. So this is kind of fundamentally why layer 2s that just magically replicate Ethereum don't exist yet. So this is from a blog post and a Serpent script. Who here remembers Serpent? That I wrote back in 2014. This is an idea that I called as shadow chains back then. And basically the principle here is that it's a scalability solution that tries to scale scale computation without scaling data, right? So the idea here is that blocks get published, but blocks don't get executed by default. Blocks only get executed if someone challenges them. So this is an idea that I kind of came up with, wrote it up, and at the time, I thought that I did not really pursue it because I thought it doesn't really give that much scalability. Like it's, okay, you're getting rid of the computation, you're not getting rid of the data, it seems like you're getting rid of half the cost, so it's a 2x improvement. In reality, that turned out to be a mistake. So it turns out that there is this kind of really nice fact that we can rely on, which is that data is cheaper than computation. And there's a lot of deep reasons why, right? So first of all, it's just an empirical observation. Like people have done analysis of the extent to which bigger blocks affect network latency versus the extent to which blocks with more computation gas affect network latency. And it turns out that data is currently overpriced. And so this is why in the next Istanbul hard fork network upgrade, there's going to be these EIPs, and one of the EIPs is going to lower the cost of call data from 68 gas per byte to 16 gas per byte. So data is getting cheaper. Second, because data-heavy applications make the blockchain less vulnerable to DOS attacks, basically. So does anyone here remember the 2016 Shanghai DOS attacks? No. So the reason why those can happen is because computation is very heterogeneous. There's many kinds of computation, and so it's very easy for some kinds of computation to just be much more difficult for some clients to execute than others. And so those kinds of DOS attacks are very hard to kind of root out. Data, on the other hand, well, data is fungible. A byte is a byte. And so with data, it's more difficult to just kind of parallelize the chain by sending the chain data that's formatted in weird ways, because ultimately bytes are just bytes. So third, transactions can be compressed. So an Ethereum transaction is about 100 bytes. Turns out the majority of that is a signature. 65 bytes as a signature. And there's plenty of ways to compress signatures. BLS aggregation is one of them. Just shoving all the signatures into a ZK snark is another one. Lots of ways to compress signatures so that to the point where each signature is like, kind of marginally speaking, ends up being 1 byte or less per transaction. Second, you can compress addresses. Addresses are 20 bytes long, but if your entire system has only 10 million accounts, then you can really, you only really need 10 million indices, and so you can compress addresses to 3 bytes. Third, you don't really need more than 1 byte for the fee. So you can really do a whole bunch of optimization, and in many cases, you can compress the size of a transaction that you need to put on chain all the way down to 10 bytes. So, and fourth, we really heavily underpriced the storage, and so storage gas prices are going up in Istanbul. So, ZK rollup. So this is a different spin on this idea, but that works kind of differently, that I came up with about a year ago. So the idea with ZK rollup is it actually is an instance of this kind of computation off-chain, data on-chain model of scalability. The way ZK rollup works is you have a contract, and the contract stores the Merkle root of the state. It stores the Merkle root of this tree that contains everyone's account balances. Users send on some network transactions, and these transactions are just 11 bytes that are from address to address value fee. Technically, you don't actually even need to include the nonce, and the signature. Then there exist these actors called relayers. Relaying can be permissionless, anyone can be a relayer, and the relayers can gather transactions, and they create a ZK snark. And what the ZK snark basically says is it's a cryptographic proof that proves that if you have whatever a state whose hash is whatever the existing hash is, and you apply the signatures or the transactions that are this set of data. So you don't put the signatures on chain, just the set of data that's without the signatures, just those 11 bytes. And if you apply all of those transactions, then the state that you get at the end is this new Merkle root. And also, by the way, there exist valid signatures for all these transactions. I'm not telling you what they are, but there exist valid signatures, so you should be happy and know that they're all authorized. So you have this cryptographic proof that proves this statement that just says, if the state before was this, and you apply the transactions that have this data, then you get this new state, and everything is valid in the middle. Then you just publish it on chain, right? The relayer just publishes on chain the data without the signatures, so 10 bytes per transaction. And it also publishes the new root hash, and it publishes a snark. The contract takes that, verifies all of it, and if it's happy, then the contract just sets the root to be the new root provided in that transaction. So basically, the idea here is that you're running a kind of weird kind of quasi-side chain where transaction data is on chain, and just enough data is on chain to allow any user to independently compute the entire state if they wanted to. which is important because what that means is that if the existing real layers disappear, then new ones can calculate the state and new ones can start participating. But everything else is off-chain. Signatures are off-chain, the storage of the state is off-chain, lots of things are off-chain. So basically you have just enough stuff that's on-chain that you don't have the data availability problem, everything else is off-chain, and ta-da, you have 500 transactions a second. So the cost of it is about, like, if you kind of fully amortize it, it's about 748 gas. The scheme can also process instant deposits and instant withdrawals because you don't have any kind of interactive key, you do everything with snarks. So there's basically, like, you don't really have trade-offs the way you have with layer 2. And with Istanbul EIP 2028, that 748 is going all the way down to 176. So who here knows how much gas a transaction takes now on the Ethereum chain? Just simple transactions. Yeah. I think 26 is it less or greater than 21,000? Who here thinks it's greater? Who here thinks it's greater than 1% of 21,000? Yeah, less than 1%. So optimistic roll-up, right? So this is a kind of revamp of the shadow chains idea from way back. And the idea here is basically, we're going to do the exact same thing as ZK rollup, except here we're too lazy to make proofs. Like ZK snarks are complicated and hard, wild trusted setup. We don't want to do that stuff. Cryptography is annoying. So instead, let's do everything we did, but with interactive verification instead. Because high school people can understand interactive verification. Who here is a high school person who understands how ZK snarks work? Who here is a high school person that can kind of get how interactive verification works? See, there we go. See, this is like very interactive verification. And it's much easier to understand and implement, right? So basically, withdrawals have a delay of 1 week, and blocks published to the chain. So when you publish a block to the chain, you don't have to publish a ZK snark. You just, along with the block, send a deposit and you sign it, and that's it, right? So blocks published to the chain can be challenged within 1 week. So the chain doesn't just store the latest root hashes, it also stores kind of the hashes of blocks that have been published within the last week. And within a week, any block can be challenged. And if you challenge a block, then you basically have to provide an index to what the block is that you're challenging. And you also have to provide a witness, and a witness basically means you provide just the Merkle branches of the state that are touched by that particular block, and that gives you just enough data that that block can be verified on chain. You verify the block on chain, and if it turns out that block that was published all the way back then was invalid, then you revert the entire chain all the way from that point forward. That's it, right? And then after a week, blocks get finalized, and so users will basically have to verify blocks themselves if they want to get a fast finality guarantee, right? So if I pay you like 2 DAI for a coffee, and you want to know right now that the 2 DAI are legitimate, and I pay you 2 DAI inside of an optimistic rollup, like you can just verify the entire optimistic rollup chain yourself, and that way you can be happy knowing that because no block is invalid, there's no way there's going to be a successful challenge, so it's mathematically impossible for a block to get reverted. So, no need for snarks. One other reason why no need for snarks is a nice feature is that it makes this much easier to generalize, right? This doesn't just have to be a payment system. You could very easily just have fully general purpose EVM code running inside an optimistic rollup. Just like EVM as it is today. One change is that because you don't have a snark, you can't just like make the signatures disappear. So you do need to have an aggregate VLS signature. And an aggregate VLS signature is about 1 extra byte per participant. Out of that, 1 bit is the bit that says who participated, or you don't even need that. You need the 1 byte because basically it's amortized. There is a maximum number of participants you can put into a signature for the thing to still be verifiable inside 1 block, and you just divide like the 6496 bytes by that. The signature only gets verified if someone challenges it. So there we go, that's optimistic rollup. Yay. Same scalability. ZK rollup. So this is ZK snarks inside of a ZK rollup. So you can do ZK rollup with privacy. Yay. So statistics, right? Ethereum gas limit, 8 million, block time 13.2 seconds. The theoretical maximum the current rollup can do the math, blah, blah, divide, 759 transactions a second. This is a theoretical maximum. We've already seen 100 transactions a second on chain. It turns out that the main bottleneck is snark proving. So this is like another reason why optimistic rollup is interesting as well, right? So it's got this trade-off where you don't have to deal with all these snark issues, but on the other hand, which you always take a week. Post Istanbul goes up from 759 to a theoretical max of 3228. So there we go. Other benefits. Almost no on-chain state. So a ZK rollup contract only basically needs to have 32 bytes of state. And you can make an optimistic rollup contract also only have 32 bytes of state. Basically, you would just be requiring anyone submitting challenges to submit extra Merkle branches, and you'd have to store a more complicated accumulator structure. Easy to implement as an ETH2 environment, very robust against future changes like adding rents to Ethereum, like stateless clients. And basically, because it's a contract with offline storage, it doesn't care about any of that. It gets relatively better post-quantum. So post-quantum, you lose a bit of efficiency because instead of snarks, you have to have starks. Instead of aggregate ELS signatures, you have to have starks. But otherwise, the data requirements don't increase, whereas any non-rollup application would have to have basically a huge amount of data blow up and computation blow up because they have to switch to less efficient post-quantum signature schemes. Also gets relatively better with privacy. So the data requirements do blow up again from 10 back up to about 100. Challenge, maybe some little really smart person here will figure out a way to optimize it down to like 1 hash plus 10 bytes. But avoiding on-chain computation becomes more lucrative when the computation you're avoiding isn't just a signature, it's also a ZK snark. So that's full on-chain data protocols. Hybrid on-chain data protocols. So there is this entire design space that's kind of in between rollups and things like Plasma. You can take Plasma and you can sacrifice a bit of scalability and gain considerable generality and user experience by publishing some data on the blockchain. So for example, if you have a Plasma decentralized exchange, it turns out that if you publish the order matching on chain, then the amount of history you have to store goes down, the complexity of the protocol goes down, lots of bad things go down, and lots of nice things go up. Plasma chains that periodically publish history commitments. So Plasma chains periodically just publishing claims that say, for this particular state object, the current active state is after this point. And if you just publish these claims on chain from time to time, the amount of history information clients need to store just goes way down. A Plasma system that publishes data for transactions that go to and from, things like Uniswap that don't have owners, but anything between things that do have owners go off-chain. So there's this entire intermediate design space that could be explored. Rollups and sharding. So when you have sharded blockchains, rollups get even more fun. So basically, let's imagine you have a rollup, and this has to be an optimistic rollup. It can't be a ZK rollup because this really crucially relies on delayed state calculation. So you have a rollup where users are allowed to publish transactions on one of multiple shards. Then you have a kind of process and this kind of execution game that enforces a rule that says that the transactions get executed. To calculate the state, you have to look through all the shards and you have to look through them in a particular order. First this shard, then this shard, then this shard, then the next block here, then here, then here, then the next block up, down, down, up, down, down, right? Now, then what we do is at layer 1, we basically stagger the shards. Or potentially we even allow shard blocks to just be published at random points in time. And we have a kind of voluntary measure where block producers can just voluntarily signal in advance and say, hey guys, I'm planning to publish a block in 1 second, please send me stuff. And so if you have this kind of protocol, then even if the block time on any particular shard is 10 seconds or even 1 minute, then you can have a system where the state from the point of view of the layer 2 rollup system is, or updates more often than once every second, and so you have kind of de facto layer 2 almost instant block times. Yay!
Sorry, could you repeat that last bit, please?
Yay! Layer 2 nearly instant block times. Joy. Hybrid on-chain data. So challenges, right? So probably the biggest challenge here is figuring out how fee markets work. So the challenge with fee markets here is this, right? So basically, let's say that everyone is using rollups, and so we have 2 orders of magnitude higher scalability. Yay! But let's say you, as a user, you just got some money. You have your magical optimistic rollup wallet, and you got a rollup ETH. Yay! You have a rollup ETH. And then you want to send 0.01 rollup ETH to pay for a coffee. Well, you want to send a transaction. Problem is that you don't have any layer 1 ether, right? You just have this layer 2 ether, which is this really funny kind of claim inside of this weird crypto-economic interaction that miners don't understand. And so you yourself can't just get your transaction published to chain, right? In fact, there's no point in you yourself getting a transaction published to chain, because then you're not going to get all these benefits of aggregation. So basically, what we need to have is this kind of protocol involving intermediaries, right? You have this network of intermediaries, and there was this recent proposal called gas station network, which seems interesting to create a network of these. And these intermediaries basically collect transactions and collect fees inside of the rollup. Yes?
So doesn't this become like Lightning
I would say it's considerably less complex than Lightning. Basically, so it's not like a watchtower, right? Because you as a user do not need to subscribe to one. Your user experience is still, you publish to the decentralized cloud, and someone picks it up. So it is more like, the fact that there is a layer of intermediation at all is the reason why I'm making this slide and saying that it's a challenge. But it's definitely not the sort of thing where you have to deal with multiple kinds of service providers and do all of that stuff. So basically, you as a user pay your fees, and inside of the rollup protocol, pay your fees to whoever the relayer is that includes it, and the relayer is going to have ETH, and the relayer is going to pay a transaction fee of ETH to get included on chain and pay it to the miner. So the problem here is basically analyze this market. What are the risks of this market centralizing? If the market does centralize, is there a risk to censorship resistance? One possible argument against is that even if it does centralize, that if whoever is the monopoly relayer gets us to start censoring people, then that just creates a huge incentive. Basically, someone else will be able to collect the fees that are being censored, and then someone else will be able to just kind of quickly jump in and grab the unused the profit that the first person is forgoing. So, thing that we're all actively thinking about at this point. So conclusions, I guess this is a kind of pragmatic moderate scaling paradigm. And the reason why I call it pragmatic and moderate is because it doesn't claim to offer as much kind of jaw-droppingly high scalability as all of the various tribes of people claiming over 9,000 transactions per second with no trade-offs are claiming. But on the other hand, the thing actually has fewer trade-offs than other layer 2 solutions. I mean, arguably even fewer trade-offs than pure layer 1 scaling. But of course, the eventual goal is that you combine this with pure layer 1 scaling and you have even more scalability. Also, there's a big opportunity to kind of look at this intermediate design space, combine off-chain and on-chain techniques to improve plasma, and if you have a sharded base layer, you can achieve even stronger properties. Yay! Yay!
Okay, so questions about the presentation first.
Yes, about the presentation only.
Hi, Vitalik. It's Jeremy from Funfair here. Very, very interesting to hear this. Just had a couple of quick questions about the relays and the way in which they put data on the chain. Obviously, in Ethereum, you have this kind of concept of uncles. And if you have, do you have like the next block is published by someone, or there can obviously be a semi-infinite number of next valid blocks. How do you, what happens if two people try and post different next blocks at the same time? And I guess a similar question related to that is if someone publishes a bad block and no one challenges it, I mean, how many transactions do you have to revert? If you talk about a week, is that the whole last week's worth of transactions that are void? Or is there
Yeah, so for the second question, yes, you'd pretty much have to revert the entire week, which is why, like, if you as a user are received a payment inside of a system, then you probably should actually verify the internal transactions yourself, or have some other mechanism for doing it, because otherwise there is a risk that it'll get reversed all the way up to a week. But the risk is going to be low, because if a block does get reverted, then everyone who submitted a block after that point is going to lose their deposit. So you could just say, oh, it looks like there's been 2,000 Ether worth of deposits after this period, I guess I'll just trust it. That's your personal choice. For the first question, yes, it is, it definitely is the case that if two different participants publish, I like calling them packages, just publish packages at the same time, then realistically the two packages are going to point to the same parent, and then whichever one of them gets included on chain first is going to be valid and accepted, and whichever one gets included second is just going to waste a bunch of gas, and there could be inefficiencies from that. It's more severe in ZK rollup than in optimistic rollup, because in ZK rollup you have to spend all of this extra effort generating a ZK Snark, which is actually pretty expensive to generate. It's like thousands of times more time than it takes to generate a block. But even in optimistic rollup, you're still risking gas fees. One solution that I saw is basically in order for someone to be a relayer, they have to deposit ETH. And then everyone who deposited ETH, basically there's a kind of round robin protocol that just keeps on assigning slots in order, or possibly randomly assigned slots. And so you have a kind of 1 block or 2 block monopoly during which you can submit things. That's one possible mitigation. There might be others too. Yeah, very back row, why not?
Yeah. Can you pass it on?
You're right there. So I was wondering, are you concerned at all, or are the Ethereum project concerned at all about the fact that Polkadot might beat you with some of the sort of technical implementations that you've outlined tonight?
Polkadot's definitely free to use anything interesting that we've come up with, because it's an open internet, and there's not real the open internet makes collaboration compulsory, which is great for humanity. And that's, I think it's fine. They can use our stuff. We've benefited quite a bit from Definity's work on BLS signatures, for example. We've benefited even from just watching Cosmos launch a proof of stake chain and seeing what the successes and what the issues have been. I think it is what it is, and I think it's a totally fine thing.
Okay, one more here. Then I'll move to the other
Hi
side.
there. So I see from a kind of business and a customer perspective like a tug of war. And so the business wants the least friction when they're issuing their tokens or using their token in the token economy, and the customer also wants the least friction, but they want the highest price, and the business wants the lowest price. Who tugs most vigorously?
Wait, which market are we talking about here? Who's the business, who's the customer?
Well, so someone like Salt Lending, for example, the successful lending platform. If they want
Is
the
this
least-
is this specific to optimistic roll or ZK rollups?
if they want to do it all privately, maybe.
Okay.
It's a general question, though.
Yeah,
Ask it. But is there a tug of war between the business that wants?
I mean, there's a tug of war between buyers and sellers in any market. I mean, generally, I guess you'd expect it to hit a competitive equilibrium if the market is competitive at all. And if one or both sides are less competitive, then you hit an equilibrium, but it's just less efficient.
Okay, next question. I'll come to you afterwards.
This is regarding the presentation. Can you articulate the trade-offs you're talking about at the end? Wow. And can you compare them to like the trade-offs there are, for example, in Lightning Network, just because that's what I'm familiar with?
Sure. So I guess I can compare and contrast quickly 4 systems. One of them is layer 1 blockchain. So the second is optimistic rollup, third is ZK rollup, and the fourth is Lightning Network / Plasma / channels. So the reason why rollups are better than layer 1 is because they have about 100 times more scalability. The reason why think Plasma state channels and Lightning Network are better than rollups is because they have potentially even more scalability. And in the case of channels particularly, so including Ride and including Lightning and all of those, you get this other particular benefit, which is like instant finality. The reason why rollups are better than Plasma and channels and Lightning is that they are much easier to generalize, so it's much easier to use them for general purpose applications and going beyond payments. Another reason why they're better is that even the use cases that are just for payments tend to come with trade-offs. So for example, Lightning has very high capital lockup costs. There's limits to how much you can transact. Like you have all these pathfinding issues. In the case of Plasma, you have fewer of those issues, but you have this other issue, which is clients need to store and verify history data. With rollups, you don't have any of those issues. The main difference between optimistic versus ZK rollup is basically ZK. The big benefit ZK rollup gives you is that you can exit instantly instead of exiting after a week. And also, if there's no risk of you losing money if the chain breaks for longer than a week. The reason why optimistic rollup is better is that optimistic rollup, first of all, is easier to generalize. Second, is easier to build, and third, potentially has fewer economic challenges because you don't have this issue of having to pay a fairly large computation cost to generate the ZK snark proofs.
This one here. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I was just wondering, should it be possible to create use the Ethereum chain right now to create a system similar to optimistic rollup, simply by creating a full node that just downloads the block data, but accepts challenges for invalid state transitions?
So you're saying, can we replicate the benefits of optimistic rollup by just massively increasing the Ethereum chain's capacity and replacing all of the full nodes with clients that accept fraud proofs?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, arguably Ethereum 2 is partially that, right? The main, I guess the one main kind of other insight. So first of all, the strategy is legitimate because Ethereum 2 is adopting it to some extent, but also it's not just fraud proofs. It's if you're going to scale the chain up, then you're also going to need more data. And if you have more data on chain, then you also need to have some method of verifying data availability at scale. And data availability proofs do exist, but they do have a couple of extra assumptions attached. Now, one thing you could also ask is, well, why can't we have a blockchain that has lower data capacity but very high computation capacity? And I mean, I guess you could have that, and that's an option that has been underexplored. I mean, there's definitely lots of things in this design space to choose from.
Okay, one more, yeah.
So this is a deployment question. So you've proposed and explained this great optimistic roll-up idea. How do we get it deployed? How do we standardize it? How do we get wallets to support it? How do we get users to be able to make transactions in this way?
I mean, someone just has to build the thing and build it in such a format that they don't try to like sneak some stupid ICO token into the middle of it.
So if someone had the ability to influence a foundation, perhaps, and maybe that foundation could actually sponsor this
The
project.
Ethereum Foundation is absolutely open to getting grants for this sort of thing.
Hi, sorry. So I'm happy to say I kind of understand about 10% of what you say now. Like when I entered the space, I really didn't understand anything, so it's nice. So my way of processing this is basically we are compressing a load of data and putting only the compressed part on chain, right? And you said the state is not on chain anymore?
Yes.
So where is all the data?
The data that is published on chain is just enough data for that users can calculate the full state locally if they want to. And so there are going to be users that will have calculated the state and will have this data and will be keeping it maintained. But like information theoretically speaking, like the stuff that is on chain is enough to regenerate everything else.
You want more here?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Hi. So, thank you for the presentation. I went to a CK cryptography event over the weekend, and it's an area which I'm just beginning to learn about. I learned that stocks are quantum resistant, stocks aren't essential. But there's a whole bunch of other people in the field who are way smarter than I am, academics doing research. Alex over here. Now, you mentioned earlier on Twitter about academic papers being released in PDF form. You said that that's a problem because a lot of...
Technically, Robert Wiblin said that, I just agreed.
But you said that for the even for the educated, it was pointed out that even for the educated public, like probably a lot of people in this room, who would like access to these things, who would like access to these bodies of research that real academics are doing. Your blog is amazing, it's really clear, you write very, very clearly. But you said also on that Twitter thread that you had some more thoughts about that thing. I think it's maybe not such a specific question, but my specific question is more, how can we get the academic papers about these things to people who want to read about them and in what format as well?
Yeah, and I think like it's not. There's like a couple of different ways to go about this, right? Like one is that for people who are already writing papers to kind of do more to keep in mind the fact that their like the audience of their papers isn't just people who are all like almost exactly like them, that are as deeply steeped in the space as they are, and they just like have to dump things down a bit, and it's just part of an intellectual's job to communicate. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that like there definitely is still a niche for people to kind of take existing ideas and kind of redescribe them in a form that is like more accessible than the original form, like whatever the original writing is, in the case the original writing is not that accessible, but not kind of dumbed down to the point of being like popular science material that says, you know, really is stupid and crazy stuff that's like totally factually incorrect. So yeah, I mean, there's this kind of in-between niche that just could be captured more, I guess. I definitely be really happy to see more people doing that.
So back to the ruler, how does what does it look like from an archive node? So like, how does it recreate all this state transitions, progressing all this?
Basically, so a node would just be able to read all of the transactions that went to that particular contract and called that particular function, and it would just like run the state transition function. It would just process all of them in sequence. Now, if the rollup has been running for many years, then like you don't really want to have to scan years worth of the blockchain. So then what you would do is you would just go to the network and you would say, hey, does anyone have a state that is more than like 1 week old? And then
you have to adjust the code within the current time.
No, so the point is that anyone who doesn't care about the rollup, about the optimistic or ZK rollup system, doesn't need to care about it. If you are not participating and you don't are not verifying any of the data associated with it, that's fine. So an archive node of Ethereum will not be automatically an archive node of every rollup on Ethereum. I mean, if you want to make a super archive node that is an archive node of all those things, you can. But then, like, you'll just have to store more data and keep more data, and staking will take longer. Maybe one more last question.
Is there a risk? Is there a risk that if you scale too much, that all the work you do to make light clients lighter is undone?
I would say no, because like these techniques don't really increase the burden on light clients particularly, right? So I guess like first of all, if you're not participating in one particular layer 2 system, then you don't have to care about it. It doesn't affect your security model at all. Second, if you are not participating, you are participating in a layer 2 system, then there are going to be ways to kind of have a lunch client for it, right? So like for example, as I mentioned, there's this, if you want to just download branches from a state, you can download Merkle branches, you can verify them. If you want to make sure that a state is correct without verifying all of it yourself, then either you can just rely on the existing deposits, or potentially you could like have some federated system where you trust one event servers, or you could have a market where other participants just like put down more deposits voluntarily. So there's lots of ways to do this sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's it.